When I first laid eyes on the Avery Grand Theater, it was little more than a husk of its former self. Tucked away on Austin's historic Main Street, it stood as a monument to forgotten glamour, its facade marred by time, its once gleaming marquee now dull and barely legible. Yet, even in its decay, I could sense a kind of dignity, as if the building itself remembered the splendor it once hosted. Restoration projects had become my specialty as an architect. This particular assignment, however, held a certain charm. The goal was not only to restore the Avery, but to have it ready for a Christmas gala, a tribute to its past glories. From the moment I accepted the commission, I felt drawn to the theater, as though it were calling me to uncover its secrets. Work began swiftly. The crew peeled back layers of dust and grime, revealing ornate woodwork and faded murals beneath. My own focus, however, shifted when I stumbled across a locked door at the back of the stage. It was hidden behind a false panel, unnoticed by anyone until I pointed it out. "Must have been a storage room," one of the workers remarked, handing me the key we had found among a pile of old blueprints. When the lock clicked open, I stepped inside. The air carried a strange heaviness, thick with an aroma of mothballs and aging wood. My flashlight swept across the small, cramped space, a forgotten dressing room, untouched for decades. The walls were lined with mirrors framed in tarnished brass, and the counters were scattered with relics, yellowed playbills, makeup containers, and a journal bound in cracked leather. One item stood out among the clutter, a silver locket resting atop the journal. Inside, a photograph of a young man stared back at me, his expression solemn, his eyes unsettlingly vivid despite the faded ink. I turned the locket over to find initials engraved on the back, HD. The discovery excited me more than I'd admit. It wasn't every day that you unearth a piece of history. But that night, as I pored over the journal's brittle pages, unease crept into my thoughts. The entries were sparse, fragmented. The writer, whom I assumed to be the man in the photograph, spoke of a role he'd longed for, a performance that never saw the light of day. The final entry was scrawled in uneven handwriting. "They will know the truth when the curtain rises." As I closed the journal, a strange noise stirred in the empty theater, a faint shuffle, like the drag of footsteps over the old stage boards. I dismissed it as the echo of a restless mind. But as the night wore on, I felt a presence within those walls, an unshakable awareness of being observed. The Avery was waking up, and I feared I had disturbed something best left forgotten. The following day, the theater hummed with activity, the workers hammering and sawing, oblivious to the peculiar energy that had begun to stir within its walls. I, however, couldn't shake the memory of the journal, its ominous final entry gnawing at the edge of my thoughts. Still, I told myself that history was merely history. That evening, as the crew filed out and darkness reclaimed the theater, I lingered. The silver locket weighed heavily in my pocket, and the journal rested in my bag, an invitation to further obsession. But it wasn't obsession that kept me there, it was an inexplicable pull, as if the theater itself were summoning me back to its shadowed corners. I wandered onto the stage, the cavernous auditorium spreading out before me like a slumbering beast. Rows of seats sat cloaked in pale dust covers, and the faint scent of pine drifted from a half-decorated Christmas tree near the back. Everything seemed still, yet the air buzzed with a peculiar anticipation, like the silence before a storm. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the balcony. At first, I thought it was a trick of the dim light, the shadows playing with my imagination. But as I stepped closer, I caught sight of a figure standing there, motionless, watching. It was a man, or rather, the faint outline of one, his edges blurred as though he were part of the dimness itself. He was dressed in a suit, old-fashioned, his head tilted downward, observing me with an intensity that froze me to the spot. "Who's there?" My voice echoed, thin and hollow. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and seemed to dissolve into the gloom, vanishing behind a velvet curtain that hung limp over the balcony's entrance. My heart hammered as I forced myself to move, rushing up the creaking staircase to follow. But when I reached the top, there was nothing. The curtain swayed faintly, though there was no draft to disturb it. I stepped closer, and my breath caught in my throat. A message had been scrawled across the dusty fabric, as though by a finger tracing its way through the grime. Find the truth, or face the consequences. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The message hadn't been there before, I was certain of it. Yet the words stared back at me, bold and undeniable. The next morning, I told myself it had been a dream, an overactive imagination fueled by the eeriness of the theater. But as I stood in the theater's office, reviewing architectural plans, the journal's pages pressed heavily in my bag, a faint sound reached my ears. It was music. Faint, hauntingly familiar, a melody played on an old piano, wafting from somewhere deep within the theater. I stepped into the corridor, following the sound as it wove through the building like a thread pulling me along. The music led me back to the hidden dressing room. The door was slightly ajar, and as I entered, the melody ceased. My flashlight swept the room, its beam catching the faint outline of something etched into the mirror above the counter. Words. Open the curtain. The stage awaits. The mirror trembled, or perhaps it was my hand that shook. Either way, the message remained, stark and insistent. The locket burned cold against my skin, and in that moment, I knew that whatever I had awakened would not rest until its story was told. But whose story was it, and what would I uncover when the curtain finally rose? By the third evening, the Avery Theater no longer felt like a worksite, but a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. The journal and the locket remained with me, their weight both literal and metaphorical. Each time I touched them, I felt the presence of something lingering, unseen, but not unfelt. The crew had gone home hours earlier, and the theater stood cloaked in a heavy stillness. I walked the stage, a strange compulsion urging me onward. The message on the mirror haunted my thoughts, open the curtain. The stage awaits. But I had no intention of obeying, not without understanding what lay beyond. As I stood in the center of the stage, my eyes wandered to the ancient curtain that separated the auditorium from the backstage area. It loomed like a boundary, its heavy velvet folds strangely foreboding. My pulse quickened as a whisper of movement caught my attention, a flicker in the periphery. I turned sharply, scanning the rows of darkened seats. At first, I saw nothing. But then, from the far corner of the auditorium, the faint glow of a lantern appeared. Its light bobbed gently, as if carried by an unseen hand, weaving between the aisles with deliberate slowness. Who's there? My voice rang out, steady but strained. The lantern paused, its glow intensifying for a brief moment before extinguishing entirely, leaving me in darkness once more. My breaths came shallow, my grip tightening on the edge of the stage. Then, the sound began. It started softly, a rhythmic creak, as though old floorboards were bearing the weight of slow, deliberate footsteps. The sound echoed through the empty theater, growing louder with each beat, moving closer. I backed away instinctively, my heels catching on the edge of a loose floorboard. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a long moment, silence pressed against my ears. And then the voice came. Low, resonant, and filled with a quiet desperation, it echoed from somewhere unseen, "Do not abandon me." I spun toward the source, but there was no one there. Only the curtain, motionless yet heavy with an unspoken threat. Summoning every ounce of resolve, I approached the side of the stage, where an old rope pulley controlled the curtain. My fingers brushed the coarse fibers, trembling with indecision. The words from the journal echoed in my mind, "They will know the truth when the curtain rises." I pulled the rope. The curtain groaned as it began to lift, revealing the dark expanse of the backstage area. At first, there was nothing, just the skeletal frame of set pieces and scattered props. But as the last fold of velvet ascended, I saw it. The figure from the balcony stood in the center of the backstage floor, illuminated by a faint, ghostly glow. His features were sharper now, unmistakably the same as the man in the locket's photograph. His eyes locked on mine, and for the briefest moment, I felt a pang of sorrow, a pain that did not belong to me but pierced through my chest nonetheless. "You opened the door," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Now, you must finish what I could not." Before I could respond, the theater erupted in sound, pounding footsteps, whispers swelling into a cacophony, and the faint strains of an unseen orchestra tuning their instruments. The figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving me alone on the stage as the invisible audience roared to life. The applause was deafening. I stumbled back, my head spinning as the sound enveloped me. The theater came alive, the seats filling with spectral forms, their faces blurred but their eyes fixed on the stage. "Reveal it," the voice came again, this time from everywhere and nowhere. "Show them the truth." My eyes darted to the journal, which I had left on a work table nearby. Its pages fluttered as though caught in a wind only it could feel. With trembling hands, I reached for it, unsure if I was uncovering history or sealing my fate. The journal trembled in my hands as though it, too, had come alive with the frenzy of the theater. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, the pounding in my chest mirroring the thunderous applause echoing through the cavernous space. The audience of blurred figures remained seated, their applause ceasing in eerie unison as if commanded by an unseen conductor. "Read it," the voice demanded, reverberating through the theater with a sinister authority. My fingers fumbled as I flipped through the aged pages, the script-like scrawl leaping out at me in places, urging me to understand a story I hadn't lived. Phrases stood out, a betrayal in the final act, the curtain never fell, and to release me, the play must end. The orchestra began again, softly at first, melancholic strings that swirled through the air, tugging at some primal, buried fear. The music was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, sorrowful yet laced with an edge of malice. I wanted to run, to flee this theater that no longer obeyed the laws of the living, but my legs refused to move. Instead, I looked out at the shadowy audience, their indistinct forms leaning forward as though waiting for my performance. My eyes locked onto one figure in the front row, its face clearer than the others, wearing the pale mask of humanity. Its eyes burned like embers, staring directly at me, unblinking. It raised one hand, skeletal and trembling, and pointed toward the stage floor. I followed its gesture, and that's when I noticed the trapdoor. Barely visible beneath the worn wooden planks, its edges outlined in faintly glowing dust, it seemed to pulse in time with the music. My knees buckled as a sudden wave of cold air surged upward from beneath it, the scent of earth and decay filling my nostrils. I dropped the journal onto the stage and knelt beside the trapdoor. My hand hesitated, hovering over the latch. The whispers from the audience grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chilling cacophony that sounded like both pleading and warning. "You must," the voice urged again, louder now, desperate. I yanked the latch. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into utter darkness. The scent of damp stone and something metallic rose from below. The whispers faded, replaced by a single, ominous sound, the slow, deliberate ticking of a clock. Summoning every ounce of courage, I descended, the stairs groaning under my weight. The faint light of the stage above receded, leaving me with only the flicker of a lantern that seemed to ignite itself at the base of the staircase. The room I entered was small, circular, and suffocatingly cold. Dust coated every surface, but at the center of the room stood a wooden podium, and on it, a single object, a tarnished pocket watch. The ticking grew louder as I approached, each beat echoing within my chest. The air thickened, the walls seeming to close in as the seconds stretched into eternity. My hands trembled as I reached for the watch, its silver casing gleaming despite the lack of light. As my fingers closed around it, the room shifted violently. The walls groaned, the ground quaking beneath my feet. From the shadows, a figure emerged, the actor, his form more solid now, his face etched with anguish. "You've brought the final act," he said, his voice both a warning and a plea. "Finish it, or the curtain will never fall." Before I could ask what he meant, the ticking of the pocket watch stopped. The silence was deafening, and the room plunged into darkness. From above, the sound of the orchestra swelled to a fever pitch, a crescendo of chaos that threatened to shatter the very air. And then, the clock began ticking backward. The backward ticking echoed like a death knell in the blackness. My grip on the pocket watch tightened as though it were the only anchor to reality I had left. The figure of the actor stood unmoving, his shadowy presence more oppressive than the walls that seemed to pulse with the ticking. "What does it mean?" I asked, my voice trembling, but the figure gave no answer. Instead, he raised an arm, pointing back toward the staircase that had led me here. The air turned heavy with the scent of burning candles, and something far less pleasant, rot. I didn't hesitate. Clutching the watch, I stumbled up the stairs, my feet slipping on the slick, worn stone. The orchestra above played furiously, the melody twisted into something frantic and discordant. When I burst through the trapdoor back onto the stage, the theater was no longer as I'd left it. The shadows in the audience now had clearer outlines, figures frozen mid-clap, their faces pale, lifeless, their mouths wide open as if frozen in silent screams. Every seat was filled, and every pair of hollow eyes was fixed on me. The stage itself had transformed, no longer the cheerful holiday set I'd spent weeks creating. Red curtains hung limp and decayed, and a spotlight shone harshly on the center of the stage, where the journal now lay open. The actor's voice rang out again, this time from everywhere and nowhere. "Begin the final act. End what was started a century ago." My hands trembled as I opened the pocket watch, its hands spinning wildly backward. The second the watch opened, the journal's pages flipped violently as if caught in a gale. A new entry appeared, written in the same spidery script, but dated tonight. "To finish the play, to restore the curtain, you must reveal the truth. The secrets buried beneath this stage must come to light." I stumbled back as the stage beneath my feet cracked and splintered. A section collapsed inward, revealing a dark pit beneath, far deeper than the shallow orchestra pit should have been. A faint glimmer caught my eye. Something was buried there. The music rose to a maddening peak as the ghostly figure of the actor materialized on the stage. He no longer appeared human. His face was a warped mask of rage and despair, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though he were a marionette controlled by unseen strings. "Dig," he commanded, his voice like thunder. "You must dig." I dropped to my knees, my fingers clawing at the loose earth as though compelled by something stronger than fear. The dirt gave way easily, and soon my hands brushed against wood, an old chest, its metal fittings corroded with time. As I pulled the chest free and pried it open, a wave of cold air erupted from within. Inside lay a collection of objects, photographs of the actor with a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to me, a stack of letters bound with a faded ribbon, and at the very bottom, a dagger crusted with rust. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place. The betrayal, the unfinished play, the anguished spirit, all tied to an unspeakable act that had taken place here, hidden away for a century. "You were her," the actor whispered now, his voice no longer commanding, but pained. "You were my muse, my betrayer. And now, you will end this." The orchestra reached its crescendo, and the shadows in the audience rose to their feet as one, their applause deafening and frantic. Before I could process the revelation, the theater shuddered violently. The lights flickered, and the actor lunged toward me, his spectral form dissolving into smoke as it collided with the objects in the chest. A blinding light erupted from within, swallowing the stage whole. And then, silence. When I awoke, the stage was whole again. The warped shadows, the crumbling wood, and the audience of hollow faces had vanished. Only the faint scent of dust and wax remained, clinging to the air like the memory of a dream that refuses to fade. I found myself alone, lying at the center of the stage. The chest was gone, along with its grim contents, but the pocket watch remained in my hand. Its hands were still now, pointing to midnight. The theater was eerily quiet. The festive decorations, so lovingly restored, now seemed garish and forlorn, their cheer hollow in the absence of life. I stood slowly, my limbs aching as if I'd run a great distance. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of a bell tolling in the distance. Midnight. As I made my way toward the wings, I felt the weight of unseen eyes. The theater's presence was different now, not hostile, but watchful, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Then I saw him. The actor stood at the edge of the stage, his figure faint and translucent, but unmistakably there. He no longer bore the twisted rage of before. His expression was one of sorrow, almost tenderness. He inclined his head toward me, a gesture of gratitude, and then turned toward the empty seats. Slowly, he began to fade, his outline dissolving like mist in the morning sun. As he disappeared, I heard his voice one last time, soft and distant. The curtain falls, and the story ends. Thank you. The weight lifted. The theater seemed lighter, brighter even, as though it had been freed from a long-held burden. I stepped off the stage and made my way toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. When I reached the door, I turned back for one last look. The theater, now silent and still, held a strange beauty, as if it had finally found peace. I stepped out into the cold night air. Snow was falling softly, blanketing Main Street in a pristine, glittering white. The sound of carolers drifted faintly from somewhere down the road, their voices warm and inviting. I held the pocket watch tightly, its metal cool against my palm. The ordeal had left its mark, but I felt a strange sense of completion. The truth had been uncovered, the wrongs of the past brought to light. As I walked home, the words of the carolers followed me. Peace on earth, goodwill to all. And for the first time in what felt like years, I believed it.